Sean Finnegan, and you are listening to Restitutio, a podcast that seeks to recover authentic Christianity and live it out today. Even though the Roman Empire chose Nicene Christianity as its quote-unquote orthodoxy, Subordinationist Christianity continued to exist, especially outside among the Germanic tribes. In this episode, you'll learn about Ulfilas the Missionary to the Goths, who not only brought Christianity to these barbarians, but also made them an alphabet and translated most of the Bible into Gothic. We'll also survey the major Germanic tribes, including the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Burgundians, Lombards, and finally, the Franks. This little-known chapter of history, when the Arian kingdoms took over the Roman Empire, had a massive effect on Europe and North Africa for centuries to come. Here now is episode 501, Early Church History, number 19, Arian Kingdoms from Ulfilas to Clovis. So, who is Ulfilas the Missionary? He lived in the 4th century from 311 to 383. In the year 340, Subordinationists ordained him as a bishop and sent him to the Goths to preach to the Goths. We haven't talked much about the barbarians, or even the word barbarian so far. A couple things about it. One, the word probably comes from making fun of the way their language sounds. Barbarian. The people in the Roman Empire, they spoke Latin in the west, and they spoke Greek in the east. The so-called barbarians are Germanic tribes who live in the north. And there were natural barriers between the Roman Empire and these northern kingdoms, namely the Rhine River and the Danube River. And if you look at a map, you can see these as the boundaries of the Roman Empire. Now, the interesting thing about Ulfilas is that it seems like nobody else had the idea before him, hey, let's go preach Christ to these people. And so it's pretty exciting to see somebody take up the mantle and do this. And Ulfilas was no slouch. He knew Greek, he knew Latin, and he knew Gothic. He lived among the Goths. He went to live with them from 341 to 347. And the Goths among whom Ulfilas works are the Visigoths. So he just has to go a little bit north. He starts to live among the Visigoths. He actually comes up with an alphabet for them because their language was not written. It was spoken only. And so he invents the Gothic alphabet. And when he did it, he dyed his hair black and he painted his fingernails black. No, I'm just kidding. That's a trend from the 90s, the Goths. Totally unrelated. But Ulfilas, he brought the Bible into the Gothic language. Isn't that incredible? That's what a missionary does. A missionary preaches the words about Christ in a spoken way, verbally, but then also makes sure that the people has the Bible, or at least whatever of the Bible he can. Philostorgius writes about this. He's a historian. He says, accordingly, Ulfila took the greatest care of them in many ways. And amongst others, he reduced their language to a written form and translated into their vulgar tongue all the books of Holy Scripture, with the exception of the Book of Kings, which he omitted, because they are a mere narrative of military exploits, and the Gothic tribes were especially fond of war, and were in more need of restraints to check their military passions than of spurs to urge them on to deeds of war. That is hysterical. So he gave them the Bible minus the books of the kings and said, God bless, wish you the best, brothers and sisters. Well, Ulfilas, we actually have a fair amount about him because as he was ordained a bishop in 340, and then he spent this time with the Goths in the 340s, as you know from our previous sessions on the Trinitarian controversy, this was the middle of the 4th century. There was a civil war, a theological civil war going on between the Subordinationists and the egalitarians, the people who thought that the Father was greater than the Son, and the people who thought that the Father and the Son were equal. And so Ulfilas does not believe that they're equal. He thinks that the Father is greater than the Son. And we have a rule of faith from Ulfilas, where he expresses his beliefs. He says, I believe in one God the Father, alone, ingenerate and invisible, and in his only begotten Son, our Lord and God, artificer and maker of the whole creation, who has nobody like him. Therefore, there is one God, the Father of all, who is also God of our God, and in one Holy Spirit, the power which illuminates and sanctifies, as Christ said after the resurrection to his apostles, and he, that is the Spirit, is not God, nor our God, but the minister of Christ, subordinate and obedient in all things to the Son, and the Son subordinate and obedient in all things to his God and Father. So we would probably call this tritheism today. We'd say it sounds like you have three gods there, Ulfilas. And you have the Father, who's the high God, who's supreme. And then at a lower level, you have the Son, whom he also is comfortable to call God and Creator. And then you have the Spirit, who is a minister. The word minister means a servant of Christ. So the Holy Spirit is kind of like on level 3 for Ulfilas. We have a little more clarity about his beliefs from a man named Auxentius, who writes, he says, he never hesitated to preach, talking about Ulfilas, one sole true God the Father of Christ, according to Christ's own teaching, knowing that this sole true God is solely ingenerate, without beginning, without end, existing uniquely, incomparably greater and better than everything. And when he was alone, not to create division or reduction of his Godhead, but for the revelation of his goodness and power, by his will and power alone, he created and begot, made and founded the only begotten God. So God made God. You see that? This second God, and he's comfortable saying that Jesus is the second God. This second God and originator of everything is from the Father and after the Father and because of the Father and for the glory of the Father. He despised and trampled upon the hateful, Ulfilas, despised and trampled upon the hateful and execrable, evil and perverse creed of the Homoousians as a devilish invention and doctrine of demons. Through his sermons and his writings, he showed that there is a difference of deity between the Father and the Son, between the ingenerate and the only begotten God, and that the Father is the creator of the whole creator, but the Son, the creator of the whole creation. And the Father is God of the Lord, but the Son, the God of the whole of creation. You can hear the antagonism. We would expect that. Anyone writing about this subject in the middle of the 4th century is going to be antagonistic. If you read Athanasius, he is nothing but mean to everyone all the time that he disagrees with. And of course, he's nice to the people on his own team, more or less. But Ulfilas is kind of got this confidence to him as well, that he thinks this is the right way to do it, and this is the faith he spreads to the Goths. This Arian Christianity, or Subordinationist Christianity, eventually spreads to all of the barbarian tribes. There's like one or two big exceptions. I'll get to that later. But before I talk about the barbarian tribes, the Gothic tribes and the Burgundians and the Lombards and all the other guys, we have to talk about the Huns. The Huns were a nomadic confederation of Mongolian tribes. Mongolia, as you might imagine, is not in Europe. It's way out east, the Asian plains. And these Huns, these fierce tribes of people, started coming west. And the barbarians looked at the Huns and said, "Oh, you guys are savages." Which I think is hysterical, because the barbarians are supposed to be savages because they wear pants instead of the toga, and they drink beer instead of wine, and they eat butter on their bread instead of dipping it in olive oil. And they look at that's the Roman perspective. And then the barbarians look at the Huns and they're like, "You guys are savage, like, we got to get out of here." And everyone is terrified of this massive horde of people coming through. And you wouldn't believe it. I found this report from somebody from around the same time that's describing what the Huns were like. And it's just amazing. The savage Huns is what I'm calling it. This is a description from Ammonius Marcellinus. He says, this is talking about the Huns, "Though they all have closely knit and strong limbs and plump necks, they are of great size and low-legged, so that you might fancy them two-legged beasts. They are certainly in the shape of men, however uncouth, but are so hardy that they neither require fire nor well-favored food, but live on the roots of such herbs as they get in the fields or on the half-raw flesh of any animal. This is the best part, which they merely warm rapidly by placing it between their own thighs and the backs of their horses. That's how they cook their meat. They never shelter themselves under roofed houses, but avoid them. They wander about, roaming over the mountains and the woods, and accustom themselves to bear frost and hunger and thirst from their very cradles. These are tough people. They wear linen clothes or else garments made of the skins of field mice. Nor do they wear a different dress out of doors from that which they wear at home, but after a tunic is once put round their necks, however it becomes worn, it is never taken off or changed till from long decay it becomes actually so ragged as to fall to pieces. They don't change their clothes. They cover their heads with round caps and their shaggy legs with the skins of kids, like little goats, not humans. Their shoes are not made of any laths, but are so unshapely as to hinder them from walking with a free gait. And for this reason, they are not well suited to infantry battles, but are nearly always on horseback, their horses being ill-shaped but hardy, and sometimes they even sit upon them like women if they want to do anything more conveniently. There is not a person in the whole nation who cannot remain on his horse day and night, the nation of the Huns. On horseback they buy and sell. They take their meat and drink, and there they recline on the narrow neck of their steed and yield to sleep so deep as to indulge in every variety of dream. None of them plow and even touch a plow handle, for they have no settled abode, but are homeless and lawless, perpetually wandering with their wagons, which they make their homes. In fact, they seem to be people always in flight. Their wives live in these wagons, and there weave their miserable garments. And here, too, they sleep with their husbands and bring up their children till they reach the age of puberty. Nor, if asked, can any one of them tell you where he was born, as he was conceived in one place, born another at a great distance, and brought up in another still more remote. Anytime I can get that like eyewitness reportage, I'm going for it. Incredible. These people were awesome horse people. Like they just knew the horse, and they were fierce, and you did not mess with the Huns. The most famous of the Huns, his name was Attila. Attila the Hun, who reigned from 434 to 453 and attacked Persia, the Balkans, Constantinople itself, did not win that one, Gaul, Italy, and terrified everyone in and around the Roman Empire, both east and west. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to the year 370. The Huns are coming. The Huns are coming. The Visigoths take one look at the Huns and they say, those guys are savage. And they petition to the Roman Empire and they say, can we come in? Sort of like ring the doorbell and say, can we come into the Roman Empire? These savages are coming. We need protection. It's a hysterical moment for barbarians all around the world. A man named Eudoxius, the bishop of Constantinople, says, you know what, let's work with these Visigoths and let's establish a communion with them. Let's agree doctrinally with them. And Eudoxius worked through Ulfilas to get the Goths to accept communion with him and the emperor. At this time, the bishop of Constantinople was a subordinationist. So was the emperor. So was Ulfilas. All three worked together with the Visigoths to broker this deal. Theodoret, a historian, talks about this. He says, Eudoxius succeeded in inducing him to persuade the barbarians to embrace communion with the emperor, so Ulfila won them over. The result is that up to this day, the Goths assent that the Father is greater than the Son, but they refuse to describe the Son as a creature, although they are in communion with those who do so. So that's a little bit about the Visigoths. In 376, they had petitioned the emperor, and they had been allowed to enter the Roman Empire. They crossed the Danube River, and they were immediately mistreated by the Roman governors in the region, so badly that in 377, the Visigoths revolted and started fighting against the Romans. In response to this, the Roman Emperor Valens, in 378, went to the Visigoths to a city called Adrianople, and he attacked. So it's outside of Constantinople a little ways, but at Adrianople, the Emperor Valens attacks the Visigoths, who had rebelled because they were mistreated. The Visigoths won. The Roman emperor died in the battle, which is unheard of. I mean, not entirely unheard of, but almost unheard of. And for the next few decades, the Visigoths just ran wild throughout the Roman Empire, conquering whatever they felt like, pillaging, and then moving on to the next place. In fact, in 410, a Visigothic king named Alaric did the unthinkable, and he sacked Rome itself. This was the impetus for Augustine to write his City of God book, because the pagans were saying, you see, that's what you get when you don't worship the old gods. This Christian stuff is no good. We just lost Rome. Who's ever even heard of that? Rome would be lost many more times after this. So the Visigoths defeated the city. They looted it. It was a massively shocking moment in the Roman Empire. And just for the record, Alaric, the Visigoth, was a level-headed guy who gave the Romans chance after chance after chance to work with them. He even gave them a really good deal where they would settle in the north and provide a buffer role between the Romans and the rest of the barbarians, and they just wouldn't play ball with them. So eventually after the third time, he's like, I'm just gonna take your city. That's it. In 418, the Visigoths left Italy and they settled in Gaul, then Spain, and set up a kingdom that lasted for centuries until 711 when the Muslims came. So the Visigoths start over here, up in the north here. Then they come down south. And then they're just kind of wandering around over here. And they're like, oh, let's take Rome. And then, oh, let's go over here. And then it's like, all right, let's settle up here in 419 and come down here. So they just kind of wander around. And then they end up in Gaul and in Spain. They fought in the Byzantine army. The Byzantines, actually, the Roman Empire in the east is called the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines actually worked with the Visigoths as they worked with all the barbarian tribes to often pit them against each other to keep them weak and to keep them from attacking them and to get them to attack the Huns because the Huns were the boogeyman. So they would sometimes provide soldiers for the Byzantine Empire, and they were actually tolerated, at least until the time of Leo I. In 589, at the Council of Toledo, the Visigoths officially switched from Arian Christianity to Trinitarian Christianity and became Roman Catholics. All right, next up, we have the Ostrogoths. The Ostrogoths were basically overwhelmed by the Huns. They didn't get the deal the Visigoths got. And they became a vassal of the Huns. They had to fight on behalf of the Huns until the year 453 when Attila the Hun died. After Attila died, the Ostrogoths were free. In the year 476, a king named Odoacer had conquered Rome. Well, not conquered, but had sort of taken leadership over in Rome from the last Roman emperor, the last Western Roman emperor, a guy named Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer had taken over. And so the Byzantine emperor said to the Ostrogoths, he said, why don't you guys go over there to Italy? He's always trying to get them to go somewhere else. Why don't you guys go over there to Italy, Theodoric and your people, the Ostrogoths, and why don't you go reconquer Italy, and then Theodoric, you can rule Italy on behalf of me, the Byzantine emperor. And Theodoric said, oh, sounds good to me. And so from 488 to 393, they conquered Italy. Of course, the Visigoths had already done this, and now the Ostrogoths are conquering Italy. And in 490, they defeated Odoacer, the king of Italy. And in 493, they killed him. Theodoric killed him. And at this point, in the peninsula of Italy, the Ostrogoths function. And this is just crazy to think, but these are barbarian tribes, but they're also Christians at this point, and they're Arians, so the Subordinationists, and they form the ruling class in Italy. And the Romans, the Roman Catholic Trinitarian Romans, are like the under-servants of the Goths for this time. So they basically rule over the Roman Catholics until the year 535, when Justinian, the very famous Byzantine emperor, comes and conquers everybody again. We'll talk about him in the future. All right, next up, we have the Vandals. All right, so the Vandals start out up north of the area above the Visigoths, above the Lombards. So they're in the sort of northeast part of Europe. And the Vandals, in 406, they cross the Rhine River into Gaul. The Vandals go west into Gaul. And then in 409, they arrive in Spain. And in the words of Malcolm Todd, found there lands that were poorly equipped to resist. And when you're a pillaging people, finding easy pickings is a good thing. So they went through Spain and they would raid all the villages and the cities and take what they can. And then in 411, they ended up settling in southern Spain, and Rome hired the Visigoths, who were right next to them, to attack the Vandals in Spain, which is like just such a classic imperial move. Of course they did, but then more Vandals arrived in the year 419 to reinforce them, and the Vandals looked around and said, you know what? Let's get the heck out of Europe. It's too hot in here, and they're all the way down there in southern Spain, and I don't know if you know this about southern Spain, but there's a little part right by the Strait of Gibraltar that is right next to Africa. Yeah. And so the Vandals decide, let's build ships. Let's build ships, and let's learn to become sea people and learn how to cross the sea. And so in 428, under Genseric, their king, they built a massive fleet, and 80,000 of them crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into Africa. And they started conquering again, so that by the year 430, pretty much all of North Africa was conquered by the Vandals, except for a few major cities, Carthage, Cirta, and Hippo Regius. If you recall, Hippo is the city that Augustine is in at this time. In fact, Augustine dies as the Vandals are attacking and besieging his city. So these things are all happening at the same time. Well, the Vandals never made it so far east as like Egypt and Alexandria and all that. They're more in the west part of North Africa. And they, in 439, do succeed in conquering Carthage, which is the major city of North Africa. If you have Carthage, you can hold North Africa. But they're not satisfied there. So in 440, they also attack Sicily, and the Romans decided, we need to get these Vandals out of here. So they paid them off, which they did a lot. The Byzantines are famous for paying off attacking people to not attack them or to attack someone else, okay? And so they paid them off in, in the year 440, but 15 years later, the Vandals are like, you know what, we're still not satisfied. And they went back and attacked Spain that they had come from, and they invaded Italy, and they even sacked Rome in the year 455. So they had a kingdom in North Africa, and they ruled for a century, until Justinian, the emperor, came in the year 533. He sent his famous general Belisarius, about whom I will tell you later, and he was able to conquer the Vandals. One other thing about the Vandals, I think I had this in my notes, but I don't see it here, is that the Vandal king did not like Roman Catholic Christians. He was an Arian Christian. He did not like them. So when they swept through North Africa, he was vicious. I mean, he would pillage not just supplies from cities, but churches, and steal everything of worth out of the churches and really try to persecute and oppress Trinitarian Christians during that time. All right, so much for the Vandals. On to the Burgundians. Has anyone here of Burgundian origins? Who knows, right? Here are the Burgundians. They're just next to the Vandals, aren't they? The Burgundians are kind of a smaller tribe, and in the early 5th century, they became Arian Christians. In 435, a man named Gondahar led the Burgundians in search for new territory. In 436, they managed somehow to get surrounded by the Huns, and the Huns slaughtered 20,000 of them at once in a big military defeat. But they weren't destroyed. There were more than that many Burgundians around, so they continued migrating, as one does when a horde of Huns is coming through. They keep moving, and in 443, they received the status from the Romans of a confederate, an official ally of the empire. And they start fighting on behalf of the Romans, and they fight the Huns. In 451, they fought against Attila the Hun, And in 456, they fought the Suebi in Spain on behalf of Rome. In this battle in Spain, they go and they do this battle on behalf of Rome, and then they're on their way back, and they're just like, you know what, this land over here looks pretty good. Might as well just move all there. And so they end up moving to a territory in eastern Gaul. In 470, they took the city of Lyon, which is in modern-day France. That's what ancient Gaul is. And Lyon became their capital in 470 of the Burgundian kingdom. In 500, Gundobad resided at Geneva and built up its defenses. But in 532, the Franks defeated the Burgundians and basically absorbed them into their kingdom. So much for the Burgundians. What about the Lombards? So glad you asked. The Lombards are a little bit after our major time of interest here, but I'm going to cover them anyhow. They settled in Bohemia and Moravia. We don't really know how they became Christians. We know that they were Arian Christians, but they were also a lot of pagans. By pagans, I mean people that worship old gods, animal sacrifice or stuff like that. In 505, they crossed the Danube River into the Roman Empire, and they made an alliance with the empire. In 552, a man named Auduin sent a large force to aid the Byzantines to fight the Goths in Italy. So you see how the Byzantines are so smart. They're going to use, well, let's see if we can get the Lombards to go fight in Italy. Oh, let's get the Ostrogoths to go fight in Italy. That's how politics was played in those days. Who's to say it's really changed much? In 568, Alboin recruited a massive army, 100,000 to 150,000 strong. And Alboin, who is a Lombard, recruits from all the tribes. He recruits his own people, the Lombards, Heruli, Bulgars, Gepids, Thuringians, Saxons, and Roman provincials into this massive army, and they are just going to start conquering Italy again. Now we're in the next century, the 500s, and they start conquering Italy. In 569, the Lombards took Milan, a major city in Italy. In 574, the Lombards and his coalition split Italy into 30 different regions, each ruled over by a duke. They pillaged the cities in the country, and this basically went on for a generation, where they would just, anytime they needed money or food, they would just pillage a nearby village or city. But eventually things have to settle down. You have to start producing, because eventually you pillage everything that can be pillaged, and everyone's going to die. We got to farm. The people in Italy were really miserable during this time, let me tell you. Eventually they organized themselves under Agilulf, who reigned from 590 to 616. He was an Arian, but his son, Adelold, was baptized a Catholic because his wife was Catholic. And then after him, eventually over time in the 7th century, which is beyond our time frame here, the Lombards actually became all Catholics themselves. All right, on to the Franks. The Franks are a big deal. It's really important to talk about them because they were so tough. So the Franks kind of started out in the middle, and they didn't really go too far. They just kind of spread out and eventually took over the Burgundians and the Alemanni and just kind of built a big old kingdom right in the middle without moving too far. In the 5th century, they were still pagans. So in the 400s, they're worshiping trees and mountains and the sky and stuff like that, maybe some idols. The Franks, though, as pagans, had no missionary impulse. There's no let's convert those Christians to worship this tree. Nobody says that among the Franks. So they just tried to get along with the Catholic Christians, which means the Roman Empire, and the Arian Christians, which means the barbarians to their east and their west and their south. They were called the long-haired kings. One of their famous kings was named Childeric. Childeric I, he reigned from 457 to 481. He was a warrior. The Franks were not yet united. So I know I've been presenting each of these different Germanic tribes as if it's one thing, but even within a tribe like the Franks, there's all these different chieftains and captains and strongmen that are vying for power and authority. And so Childeric is beginning to unite the kingdom. His dad's name was Merovech, which is why his dynasty is called the Merovingian dynasty, which is the one before the Carolingian dynasty, which people are familiar with because of Charlemagne. All right, so his son, Clovis the First, reigns from 481 to 511. And according to Joseph Lynch, the church historian, Clovis was a ruthless and ambitious man. And he is going to unite the Franks behind him. He killed off all his rivals and became the sole king of the Franks. This Merovingian dynasty lasted until the year 751. Clovis himself was a pagan, but his wife, Clotilde, was a Catholic princess from the Burgundians. She tried to convince him, as wives do, to become a Christian, and he resisted. He didn't want to become a Christian. He wanted to expand. He wanted to unite and then expand the Frankish Empire. And so he started attacking his Germanic tribe neighbors, who were all Arians, and he made war with the Alemanni, and he was losing, and he was angry, and he was in particular angry at his gods, because the way paganism works is you worship these gods, you give them sacrifices. They're supposed to hook you up when you go fight the war. And he was losing the war, so he was angry at his gods, and he said, that's it, I'm going to pray to my wife's God, to the Christian God, and see if I can get saved. And by saved, he means kill the Alemanni. Okay, it doesn't mean like from the sins. And after he prays, he wins the battle against the Alemanni. And like Constantine at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he concludes, Christ is the warrior God, and I'm going to worship him because he gives me military victory. And so he converts in the year 496, and he convinces 3,000 of his troops to convert at the same time, become baptized as Roman Catholic Christians in the region just north of Italy, what we call Gaul in those times. And he was a Nicene, a Trinitarian Nicene, not an Arian. And this came to be to their advantage because then the Roman Empire had that in common with them. As Joseph Lynch says, the Franks turned out to be the toughest barbarians of all of them. And so the Franks flourished until the 8th century, and they are the ancestors of modern France, Germany, Italy, Holland, and Belgium. You can see on the map here just how big this Frankish kingdom was. Just absolutely massive. And eventually they absorbed the Burgundians. I told you that earlier. So, I mean, they really represent a massive swath of what had been the Roman Empire, but was now ruled over by these long-haired kings, speaking this ancestor of the French language, which is just Latin all blended together so that the words sound nice together. All right, let's review. Subordinationist Bishop Ulfilas went on a mission to preach Christ to the Goths in the middle of the 4th century. Ulfilas invented a Gothic alphabet and translated the Bible into their language, sparking a movement that eventually led to the conversion of most of the Germanic tribes to Arian Christianity. When hordes of fierce Huns migrated west into Europe, Gothic tribes began migrating into the Roman Empire. This is unprecedented. Under Alaric, the Arian Visigoths conquered much of the Italian peninsula and even sacked Rome in 410 before migrating to Gaul and Spain. In the 5th century, Arian Ostrogoths under Theodoric conquered Italy and established themselves as a ruling class over the Trinitarian Romans there. In the 5th century, Arian Vandals conquered Spain, then migrated to North Africa, where they ruled for a century until the time of Justinian. In the 5th century, Arian Burgundians conquered and occupied Gaul until the Franks absorbed them in the 6th century. In the 6th century, Arian and pagan Lombards conquered much of Italy but converted to Trinitarian Catholicism in the 7th century. In the late 5th century, Clovis I, king of the Franks, converted from paganism to Trinitarian Christianity, eventually extending influence over surrounding Germanic tribes. Summary statement of all the summary statements. From the 4th to the 7th centuries, Germanic tribes who held to, because they didn't call themselves barbarians, all right? So it's just a little more polite to call them Germanic tribes. Germanic tribes who held to Arian Christianity invaded and conquered much of the Western Roman Empire, but either faced defeat by Justinian or else converted to Roman Catholicism. So that's the story of the barbarian kingdoms, also called the Arian kingdoms, or if you want to be a little more PC, the Germanic kingdoms, and how they eventually basically conquered the Roman Empire, which is just a staggering thought. Next time, we'll shift our focus to the south of the Roman Empire, to Africa, and to the east, look at Persia and India and China, and look at global Christianity outside of Europe, and leave the Mediterranean world for a little bit. And we'll look at that in our next episode as we continue through our journey of early church history.
Well, that brings this episode to a close. What did you think? Come on over to restitutio.org and find episode 501, Arian Kingdoms from Ulfilas to Clovis, and leave your feedback there. Someone writing in on YouTube said, "This is interesting. Fits in nicely with the book I just read about St. Patrick, called Let Me Die in Ireland by David Berceau. The book alluded to the invading Visigoths being supposed Christians who had a, quote, different understanding of Christ's deity, end quote, than the people in the Church of Britain at the time. I myself have read that book, Let Me Die in Ireland, and I honestly really appreciated it. I'm kind of a Berceau fanboy. I've read many of his books, and I think they're mostly really good, even though I do have some doctrinal disagreements with the great David Berceau, the great Anabaptist theologian. I would say that his book on Patrick is really good. In addition, Thomas Cahill's book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, I would argue is maybe even better than David Berceau's book if you're interested in St. Patrick and learning about the greatness of this man who had the courage to evangelize my savage ancestors. Being part Irish myself, do kind of identify with that ethnicity. So thanks for writing in. It is interesting that this sort of chapter of church history is so little known. People don't realize that for quite a long while there were Arian overlords in Rome, in what would later become the Vatican, that there were Arians actually in the ruling class for quite some time, and that the Catholics or the Trinitarians were sort of eking out an existence under that regime. So it's an interesting time to consider. Additionally, we got a review on Apple Podcasts. This is from Rush 19 Tower, entitled Preach the Good News of the Kingdom. This person writes, "This is an excellent source for alternative views of the biblical scriptures. Don't be scared. The truth has nothing to fear. I'm not afraid of my Bible anymore. Let God say what he has said. Blessings in Jesus the Messiah." Thanks for writing in. All these reviews certainly do help. I think our average rating in the American Apple's universe is something like 4.7. I have had a number of one-star reviews come in. So if you are an Apple person, I know that many of you are Apple listeners. If you wouldn't mind just hitting that 5-star button, if you believe in it, it sure would help. And if you can also write a review, it's really helpful to others who are searching for podcasts. That makes this podcast show up a little higher on the ratings. Also, we've had some folks writing in on Spotify. On episode 488, which was about Origin of Alexandria, Spotify now has an option where you can answer the question, what did you think about the episode? And someone called Genesis Makoba wrote in saying, what a great episode, love these church history classes. And someone else wrote in on episode 494, Arius and Alexander of Alexandria, called Rini, and said, I think this is a great explaining of Arius and the political religious leaders that influenced him. I didn't realize Sabellianism predated the Trinity as we know it today. Peace and love. Well, thanks for answering those questions. It's kind of a new feature on Spotify. If any of you have time and you're a Spotify user, feel free to just navigate to any of the episodes in the church history class, or you can just pick your favorite episodes out of the catalog. I mean, there's 500 there. So if you want to answer that question, or drop a rating on Spotify. Again, it helps to promote this podcast. And really, my goal with this is to get out from just the narrow niche of biblical Unitarian Christians and into the wider podcast world, because really so much of this, like take for example this church history class that is ongoing right now. We've got a couple more episodes, I think a total of 22, and then we're done. So like, who even has access to this information? It's there in the primary sources, sure, but like if you take your typical evangelical, and I know I've said this before, so please forgive me for repeating this, but if you take your typical evangelical textbooks or your typical Catholic textbooks or Eastern Orthodox textbooks, what are they going to say? They're just going to whitewash the history to make it sound like their take on Christianity was inevitable and obvious from the beginning. And look, there's nothing obvious from the beginning. In the 2nd century, there's more variety in the 2nd century than in the 4th century or in the 5th century, right? So people need to know this. They need to know the truth about what Christianity was like in the earliest years after the Bible. What did people believe? What were their doctrinal battles over? What were their practical issues that they faced? Really, I've been trying to fill that in a balanced way with this class, not trying to blow anyone out of the water or just do apologetics here, but like really give you the overview that you need to do your own research and to get your own sense of what happened, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So for those of you who are helping to spread this podcast around the internet, in your own communities, by email, on social media, whatever you do, thank you so much. It really helps a lot, and we've been growing, and it is cool to see the reach that we're able to get over time. And yet we're still just a tiny little sliver in the Christian podcasting world. So please do continue to help out, to leave ratings and reviews and share episodes. Well, that's enough for today. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Next week, we've got a very non-Mediterranean episode in the works for you. And we're looking at African Christianity, Armenian Christianity, Persian Christianity, Indian Christianity, and basically asking the question, what about the rest of the world outside of the Roman Empire? Were there Christians there too? Yes, there were. And so we're going to get into all of that next time as we continue through this class. If you'd like to support Restitutio, you can do that at our website, either through a monthly recurring donation or one-time donations. Thanks for everyone who is supporting us. We'll catch you next week. And remember, the truth has nothing to fear.